Hello pretty peoples, KawaJapa no Kyodori desu. I am Kyodori from KawaJapa. In our last lesson, we learned about the fundamental structure of the wa and ga particles as they work in sentences, the logical ga structure and the non-logical wa topic comment structure. Now that we are armed with that information, we can put it into action. If you look around the internet, you'll see various different things. You'll read about a differentiating function. You'll read about marking new information as opposed to old information in the way that a and the do in English. You will read about distinguishing one thing from other things, and you'll read about throwing emphasis forward from the particle or backward from the particle onto what comes before it. All of this information is correct. However, it gives the impression of a number of different random functions that you just have to learn connected with wa and ga. What we are going to do today is look at the way that all those functions are in fact linked together and linked together by the fundamental structures we studied last week. This is not going to make it possible for you all at once to use wa and ga correctly in every case, because whole books have been written on this subject and it is quite subtle and complex at the more advanced levels. But having a grasp of the fundamental principles and how they apply will give you a strong head start in being able to use them broadly correctly from the beginning and fully correctly as you become more and more advanced. So let's look at an English sentence which functions very much like a Japanese wa sentence. Here is the sentence. Remember Yamada-kun? A third ear is growing in the middle of his head. Now, this works very much like a wa sentence. Actually, the beginning, which is equivalent to the wa statement, remember Yamada-kun, is a logical question, but it's not really functioning that way. In most cases, you're not expecting an answer here. What you're doing is saying, remember Yamada-kun, in order to set the topic. And this is exactly equivalent to how a wa statement works in Japanese. Now from this, certain other things naturally follow. First of all, whether we say remember Yamada-kun or speaking of Yamada-kun or as for Yamada-kun, the implication is that the person listening to you knows who Yamada-kun is. You can't really say things like this if they're going to come back to you and say Yamada-kun, I never heard of him. You are taking a topic that is already known to the listener and then adding some information. So that is why we always have to use wa with something that we can assume the listener already knows. If the listener doesn't already know about it, we have to use ga. The next thing that this statement is doing is distinguishing Yamada-kun from other people. We want to talk about Yamada-kun. We don't want to talk about Sakura-chan, and we don't want to talk about that strange fellow who is always chewing gum. We are talking about Yamada-kun. So this is the second function of the wa, and again it flows from what it is. It's a non-logical topic marking particle. So the wa marked material is something we already know, and we are distinguishing that something from all the other things that we already know that might possibly be the case but aren't. And the third thing we have to notice that while we wish to distinguish Yamada-kun from other people, Yamada-kun is not the important part of what we have to say. The mere existence of Yamada-kun is not a piece of information. The information, the new information, the important information is what is happening to Yamada-kun. A third ear is growing in the middle of his head. So the wa particle distinguishes the noun that it marks from all other possibilities, but it throws the emphasis forward onto what follows it. It's not the topic itself that's important, it's what we have to say about the topic that is important. So here we have several functions of wa, and they are all clearly tied up with the way wa works as the non-logical topic marker of the sentence. They are not a set of random different functions that wa just happens to possess and we just have to learn. They are all logically connected with what wa is and how wa works. Right, now let's take 2 Japanese sentences and see how this applies. Mukashi mukashi, hime ga imashita. Hime wa utsukushikatta desu. Once upon a time there was a princess. The princess was beautiful. Now, why do we use ga in the first sentence? It's because the princess is someone we don't yet know. We are introducing her for the first time. She is making her tojo, her appearance on the stage. So we can't say, once upon a time there was the princess, because we don't know who the princess is. We have to say a princess, and in Japanese we have to say hime ga. In the second sentence we know who she is. So in English she becomes the princess. The princess was beautiful. In Japanese we can now use wa. Hime wa utsukushikatta desu. The princess was beautiful. Now we can also note that in the first sentence the thing of interest, the important thing, is simply the princess. The fact that she existed is not amazing information. After all, if she didn't exist, what could she do? The important information is the princess. So the emphasis is thrown back by ga onto the noun that it marks. The princess. Once upon a time, a princess existed. In the second sentence, the princess has become old news. We already know there's a princess. Now what we want to know is something about her. So wa throws the emphasis forward, not onto the noun that it's marking, but onto the comment that follows the noun. Wa distinguishes the noun from other things. It tells us what it is we're talking about, but then it throws the emphasis forward onto the comment. What we need to note here is that these 2 functions of wa and ga are not random functions with no particular connection to each other. They actually follow logically, don't they, one from another. New information is interesting information. New information is the thing we are actually telling someone. This is one basis of human communication, and this is the way that Japanese handles it. The ga presents new information and throws the emphasis onto the thing itself, the thing we are just introducing. The wa reminds us of an old topic and therefore throws the emphasis onto the new thing that we have to say about that topic. So these 2 functions of wa and ga are closely linked to each other and closely linked to the fundamental structure of how wa and ga work in the first place. Alright, now we have the basic principles. We know the forces that are going to be at work every time we see wa and ga. But, as I warned you in the beginning, it's not always completely simple. Some of the textbooks and online sites will tell you you can't really learn wa and ga, you have to just work out what they mean by experience. And that is half true and half untrue. The true half is that you do need experience to understand the finer points. Japanese, like every language, has subtleties and fine distinctions, otherwise there would be lots of things it could not express. The untrue part of the statement is that there are in fact basic principles you can learn, which are going to make all the finer points much easier to understand. And those are the principles that I have just taught you. Now, let's start introducing some of those finer points. The first thing to understand is that ga does not necessarily mark new information. It can also mark old information, but it will always tend to throw the emphasis back onto the noun it's marking rather than forward onto the statement we're making about it. And the more unexpected the ga is in a sentence, the more you would normally have been expecting wa or nothing at all, the stronger that emphasis becomes. So you see, this is one very clear-cut example of a case where experience is necessary. You need to know what you are expecting and how unexpected the ga actually is. I should also note that while ga can mark known information, wa cannot really mark new information. Now as for wa, up to now we have seen it sitting quietly at the beginning of a sentence, marking the topic, but it won't always be behaving quite as conveniently as that. In some cases, for example, we may see more than one wa in a sentence. Let's take an example of that. アフリカはライオンはいるけどトラはいない。Now, here we have three was in the same sentence. What are they doing? Well, the first wa is the standard topic marker. The topic of this sentence is Africa, and what follows is information about Africa. We use wa for Africa because even though Africa has not been mentioned before, everyone knows what Africa is. So what are those other two was doing? Are they also topics, or are they doing something else? Well, the answer is that they are not the topic of the sentence, but they are still doing the work that a topic does. Normally, they would be called something like the wa of distinction. They are distinguishing their subjects from everything else. And this can work rather like a but. There is in fact a but in this sentence, the kedo, but the wa underlines the distinction implied by that but. We can translate it into English this way. Speaking of Africa, lions, well, they exist, but tigers, they don't exist. It's not perhaps the most natural way to say it, but you understand what's going on. In each case, we are separating out one subject from others, and particularly from the other. In this sentence, wa is supplemented by a but in many cases, the use of wa where we expect to find ga, because usually we would say, ライオンがいる、トラがいない, wouldn't we? The use of a wa where we would really expect to see a ga is clearly distinguishing the noun marked by ga from other possibilities. And in some cases, not only will we not have a but, we might not even have the rest of the sentence, because the wa in itself is sufficient to exercise that differentiating function. Let's take an example of that. 雨は降っている. Now, that's a very simple sentence, but as I expect you know, usually we say 雨が降っている. Rain is falling. So, under what circumstances and why would we say 雨は降っている, and what would it imply? Let's take a hypothetical case. You and a friend are in Kyoto, and you're watching the weather report, and it says that it's going to snow in Tokyo. You then go to Tokyo later that day, and your friend calls you on your keitai and says, "How's the weather?" And you say, 雨は降っている. What do you mean by that? If you just said 雨が降っている, you would have been saying it's raining. But you said 雨は降っている. And the implication of that is, well, as for rain, that's falling. In other words, rain is falling, but something else isn't falling. It is raining, but it isn't snowing the way we thought it might be. Now, it's quite easy for you to interpret this sentence because you're already familiar with the fact that ame ga futteru is the usual way of saying it. Every year, we say, 今年もよろしくお願いします. That means, once again this year, please be good to me. If you were to say, 今年はよろしくお願いします, that would be a very unfortunate choice of words. The first one means, this year once again, please be good to me. But 今年はよろしくお願いします sounds as if you're saying, this year, please treat me well and don't treat me the way you treated me last year. Wa will always have this kind of differentiating emphasis to some extent, but in a sentence where we were expecting the inclusive particle mo, but we get the exclusive particle wa, the emphasis is very strong. So it requires experience to understand what we were expecting and how far the use of a different particle differentiates from the neutral kind of statement. In other cases, the main function of the wa will be to throw that emphasis forward onto what follows it. Experience and context are what is needed to interpret precisely what wa is doing in any given case, but we also need to have these basic principles in order to be able to interpret correctly. One can learn by pure experience, of course, but understanding the principles certainly makes it quicker, easier, and more accurate. Please remember that the course book for this series of lessons is Unlocking Japanese, and we recommend that you attend the lessons in conjunction with reading the book. You can get it from Amazon in paperback or Kindle editions. Thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします. Class dismissed.